The night was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, almost suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The soft hum of the ceiling fan above me was the only sound breaking through the stillness of my room. I lay on my bed, staring at the faint glow of the digital clock on my nightstand. 2:47 a.m. Sleep had become a distant memory, elusive and taunting. I couldn't stop replaying the conversation from earlier that evening. It wasn't anything extraordinary on the surface, just a casual chat with my best friend, Alex, over dinner. We'd been inseparable since college, bonded over late-night study sessions and our shared love for terrible 80s movies. Tonight, though, something had shifted, like a current beneath the surface. Alex had laughed, his dark eyes sparkling in the dim light of my apartment, and said something that struck me differently than it should have. His words were innocuous, a joke about my terrible cooking skills, but the way he said them, with that familiar teasing smile, lingered. I shook my head, frustrated with myself. "It's nothing," I whispered under my breath, as if saying it aloud could make it true. But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. There was something about the way Alex had looked at me tonight, longer than usual, as if searching for something unspoken. I couldn't quite explain it, but it sent a jolt through me, leaving me both exhilarated and terrified. The moonlight streamed through the half-closed blinds, casting faint lines across the floor. My phone buzzed softly beside me. I picked it up, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Alex's name flash across the screen. "Still awake?" the message read. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but another part, a louder, more insistent part, urged me to respond. "Yeah. Can't sleep. You?" I typed back, my hands trembling slightly as I hit send. The reply came almost immediately. "Same. Mind if I come over? I need to talk to you about something." My breath hitched. It wasn't unusual for Alex to drop by unannounced. Our friendship had always been that easy, but something about his tone felt different tonight. Urgent, maybe even nervous. "Sure." Doors unlocked, I texted back, my pulse quickening. I sat up, running a hand through my hair as I tried to calm the storm of thoughts in my head. I didn't know what Alex wanted to talk about, but I had a feeling it was going to change everything. The door opened quietly, and Alex stepped into my apartment, his familiar silhouette outlined by the dim hallway light. He looked as he always did, effortlessly put together in a way I could never match. His messy dark hair fell into his eyes, and he gave me a small, almost shy smile as he closed the door behind him. We had been friends for 5 years, ever since that chaotic first week of college when the universe, or the housing department, decided to make us roommates. From the moment we met, Alex had a way of making everything feel less intimidating. He was the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately make it warmer, more inviting. I remember that first night in our dorm room, when I'd been fumbling to put together a desk lamp I'd brought from home. Alex had walked in, taken one look at the mess I'd made, and laughed. "Need a hand, genius," he'd said, crouching down to help without waiting for an answer. That was Alex. Kind, a little sarcastic, and endlessly dependable. Over the years, we'd become each other's constants. Through bad dates, stressful exams, and the slow, inevitable crawl into adulthood, Alex had been there. I motioned for him to sit on the couch as he kicked off his sneakers, a routine so familiar it didn't require words. "So," I began, trying to keep my tone light as I joined him. "What's keeping you up this time?" Another existential crisis about turning 25. Alex rolled his eyes, but his smile softened. "Not quite," he said, leaning back against the cushions. I needed to get out of my head for a bit. And you're the only person who makes that easy." His words made my chest tighten, though I tried to brush it off. Alex had always been expressive, the kind of friend who didn't shy away from saying what he felt. It was one of the things I admired most about him. Something I had never been able to do as easily. Our friendship had always been full of these moments, comfortable silences and quiet confessions, like we existed in our own little bubble separate from the rest of the world. I thought back to all the late-night drives we'd taken when neither of us could sleep, the countless cups of coffee we'd shared while ranting about work or life. "Remember that time we got locked out of your apartment because you forgot your keys?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation to something lighter. Alex groaned, running a hand through his hair. "Please don't remind me. I'm still traumatized by the 3 hours we spent sitting on the stairs waiting for my landlord to show up.
Hey, it wasn't all bad, I teased.
We discovered that vending machine in your building that sold expired candy bars. He laughed, the sound warm and familiar, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But then his laughter faded, and he looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach flip. Can I ask you something? He said, his voice quieter now. I nodded, unsure where this was going but unable to look away. Do you ever feel like, he paused, searching for the right words. Like there's something you want to say, but you're afraid of what'll happen if you do? The question caught me off guard. I wanted to answer honestly, to tell him that yes, I felt that way every time he looked at me like this, every time his hand brushed mine by accident, every time his presence filled the room with a warmth I couldn't explain. But instead, I shrugged. I guess everyone feels that way sometimes, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Alex didn't reply right away. He looked down at his hands, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken things. You've always been the person I can talk to about anything, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But there's something I've been holding back, and it's been eating at me. My heart pounded in my chest. This was new territory, a place we'd never ventured before. Alex was many things, brave, confident, open, but this version of him, hesitant and uncertain, was unfamiliar. Whatever it is, you can tell me, I said, forcing myself to sound calm even as my mind raced.
You know that, right?
He looked up then, his dark eyes meeting mine, and for a brief moment, it felt like the entire world had stilled. The air between us crackled with something I couldn't name, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face.
Yeah, he said softly. I know.
The words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. I didn't know what Alex was about to say, but I had a feeling that once he did, there would be no going back. The days that followed Alex's late-night visit felt different, though neither of us acknowledged it outright. The change was subtle, like the first ripples in a still lake before a storm, a lingering glance that lasted too long, a silence that spoke louder than words. I started noticing things I hadn't before, or maybe I had but refused to let myself dwell on. Like the way Alex's voice softened when he said my name, or how his laughter seemed to light up a room in a way nothing else could. I caught myself holding on to these moments, storing them like secret treasures, even as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. One evening, about a week later, Alex invited me over to his place. It wasn't unusual, movie nights had always been our thing. But this time, there was a charged energy I couldn't quite place. What are we watching tonight? I asked, flopping onto his couch as he rummaged through his DVD collection. Something terrible, obviously, he said with a smirk, holding up a box.
How about Sharknado?
Classic bad movie night material.
I laughed.
You've got a real talent for picking the worst movies possible, you know that? He plopped down beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. It's a gift, he said, grinning. As the movie started, I tried to focus on the screen, but I was hyper-aware of how close we were sitting. His arm rested casually along the back of the couch, and every now and then, I felt his eyes flick toward me. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Halfway through the movie, during a particularly absurd scene involving a tornado full of sharks, Alex paused the film. Can I ask you something? He said, his tone uncharacteristically serious. I turned to him, my stomach tightening. Of course. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. Have you ever thought about, I don't know, how things might change if we weren't just friends? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I searched his face for clues. Was he joking? Testing me? But his expression was open, vulnerable, and entirely serious. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex sighed, leaning back against the couch. I mean, I think about it all the time. About us. About what it would be like if things were different. My chest tightened, and I felt a rush of emotions, fear, hope, disbelief, all at once. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing, letting the silence stretch between us. I'm not saying this to make things weird, he continued, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This was the moment I had secretly dreamed of and dreaded in equal measure. I wanted to tell him that I felt the same, that I had been struggling with these feelings for months, maybe years. But the words wouldn't come. "Why didn't you say anything before?" I asked, finally finding my voice. Alex gave a small, humorless laugh. "Because I didn't want to lose you. What we have means everything to me, and I was scared that saying it out loud would ruin everything." His honesty hit me like a wave, and I realized just how much courage it must have taken for him to admit this. "You're not going to lose me," I said, the words coming out more confidently than I felt. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine.
"Do you mean that?"
I nodded, though my heart was pounding.
"I mean it."
"No matter what happens, you're too important to me." A small, hopeful smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Does that mean you've thought about it too?" I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. But I couldn't lie, not to him, not to myself. "Yeah," I admitted, my voice barely audible.
"I've thought about it."
For a moment, neither of us said anything. The air between us was heavy with unspoken emotions, but there was also a sense of relief, like a door had finally been opened after being locked for far too long. Alex reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, like a silent promise that whatever came next, we would face it together. We didn't resolve everything that night. There were still questions, uncertainties, and fears. But for the first time, we had acknowledged the shift in our dynamic, the unspoken feelings that had been building between us for so long. And as we sat there, side by side, with the paused movie forgotten on the screen, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, something we both wanted but had been too scared to reach for.
It wasn't planned.
Nothing about that night was supposed to lead to this, yet here we were, standing on opposite sides of my living room like strangers. The tension between us was thick, the silence oppressive, and my heart pounded so loudly that I was sure Alex could hear it. The evening had started normally enough. He'd shown up with takeout, insisting that we needed a break from our questionable cooking skills. But something had been off since he walked through the door. His usual easygoing demeanor was replaced with a quiet intensity, his smiles tighter, his laughter more forced. We were halfway through dinner when he finally said it. "We need to talk," Alex began, setting his fork down with a deliberate slowness that made my stomach twist. I froze, my mind racing to fill the silence that followed. Those 4 words had the weight of 100 unspoken ones behind them, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear any of them. "Okay," I said cautiously, my voice steadier than I felt.
"What's going on?"
He looked at me then, his dark eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, hope, desperation. "I can't keep doing this," he said, running a hand through his hair. His voice was quiet but firm, like he'd been rehearsing the words in his head for weeks. "Pretending like I don't feel the way I do."
My heart dropped.
This was it, the moment we'd both been tiptoeing around for what felt like an eternity. "Alex," I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Just let me say this, okay? Before I lose my nerve." I nodded, unsure if I could trust myself to speak. He took a deep breath, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You mean everything to me. You're my best friend, my favorite person, the one I always want to be around. And for a long time, I told myself that was enough, that just being close to you was enough.
But it's not. Not anymore."
I felt the room spin, his words hitting me like a tidal wave. I opened my mouth to respond, but he wasn't finished. "I don't want to ruin what we have," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But I can't keep pretending that I don't love you." The last words came out in a rush, like they'd been trapped inside him for so long they couldn't be contained anymore. The air between us felt electric, charged with emotions that neither of us could fully control. I stared at him, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and feelings. I had dreamed of this moment, yet now that it was here, I was terrified. "You don't have to say anything," Alex said quickly, misinterpreting my silence. I needed you to know. Even if it changes everything, I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." "Alex, stop," I said, finding my voice at last. He looked at me, his expression wary, like he was bracing himself for the worst. I stood up, closing the distance between us in a few steps. "You don't get to do that," I said, my voice trembling. "You don't get to say something like that and then assume you've ruined everything." "But "Let me finish," I interrupted, taking a deep breath to steady myself. Do you think you're the only one who's been scared? Who's been holding back? His eyes widened, and I saw the flicker of hope in them. Alex, I've been trying so hard to ignore how I feel because I was terrified of losing you. You're the one person I can't imagine my life without, and the thought of messing this up, it's been eating me alive. He stared at me, the emotions on his face shifting from disbelief to relief to something deeper, something that mirrored what I felt. So, what are you saying? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
I took a step closer, my heart pounding.
I'm saying that I love you too. And I've been too much of a coward to admit it. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then, before I could second-guess myself, Alex closed the remaining distance between us. You mean it? He asked, his voice trembling. Every word, I said, feeling a weight lift off my chest. His hand reached for mine, and I let him take it, the warmth of his touch grounding me. I was so scared you didn't feel the same, he admitted, his voice soft. I smiled, a mixture of relief and nervousness washing over me.
Me too.
For the first time in weeks, months maybe, there was no tension, no unspoken words hanging between us. We stood there, holding on to each other like the world could fall away and it wouldn't matter. And then he laughed, a genuine, unrestrained laugh that made my chest ache in the best way.
What's so funny?
I asked, unable to keep the smile off my face. He shook his head, his eyes shining.
Just us.
How we've both been so stupid, dancing around this for so long. I couldn't help but laugh too, the sound breaking the tension and filling the room with something lighter, something hopeful. We spent the rest of the night talking, untangling the emotions we'd both been hiding for so long. It wasn't perfect, there were still fears and uncertainties to navigate, but for the first time, it felt like we were finally on the same page. And as we sat together, his hand still in mine, I realized that this wasn't just a turning point, it was a beginning. A chance to rewrite our story together, one chapter at a time. The morning after our emotional confrontation, the world felt different. The air seemed lighter, the colors brighter, as if everything around me reflected the relief and hope I felt. Alex and I had spent the night talking, about everything we had been too scared to say before. There were no secrets left between us now, no unspoken words lingering in the spaces between conversations. I woke up to the smell of coffee, and for a moment, I thought I was dreaming. But then I saw Alex in the kitchen, barefoot and rumpled, humming to himself as he poured 2 mugs of coffee. Good morning, he said when he noticed me, a soft smile spreading across his face. Morning, I replied, my voice still heavy with sleep but carrying a warmth that matched his. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing mine in a way that felt natural, unforced. We stood there for a moment, sipping our coffee in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes with understanding and connection. So, Alex began, setting his mug down. What now? It was a fair question. The night before had been a whirlwind of emotions and revelations, but now we were standing on the edge of something new, something we hadn't quite defined yet. I took a deep breath, setting my own mug down beside his. I don't know, I admitted, meeting his gaze. But I know I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you. He reached out, taking my hand in his. You're not going to lose me, he said firmly. We'll figure it out, one step at a time. And that's what we did. In the days and weeks that followed, things didn't change overnight. We still had our routines, our inside jokes, our shared love of bad movies and takeout. But there was a new layer to our relationship, one that made even the smallest moments feel significant. We took things slowly, navigating this uncharted territory with care. There were still fears and doubts, moments of vulnerability where one of us would question whether we were doing the right thing. But every time, we came back to the same conclusion: this was worth it. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching yet another terrible movie, Alex turned to me with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever think about how lucky we are? He asked. I raised an eyebrow.
Lucky?
How do you figure that? He smiled, his eyes warm. Not everyone gets to fall in love with their best friend. I mean, sure, we took the scenic route to get here, but we made it. I laughed, nudging him playfully.
The scenic route, huh?
That's one way to put it. But his words stuck with me. He was right. What we had was rare, something I would never take for granted. As time went on, we found a rhythm that worked for us. Our relationship wasn't perfect. There were arguments, misunderstandings and moments of doubt. But there was also laughter, joy, and a sense of partnership that made every challenge worth it. We didn't have all the answers, and maybe we never would. But as we stood on the balcony one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace. Alex leaned against the railing, his hand brushing against mine. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, his voice soft. I smiled, turning to look at him. "Just thinking about how far we've come. And how much I love you." He grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I love you too." We stood there in silence, the world around us fading away as we held on to each other. In that moment, I realized that love wasn't about having all the answers or knowing exactly what the future held. It was about choosing each other, day after day, and trusting that together, we could handle whatever came our way. As the stars began to dot the sky, Alex slipped his hand into mine, and I knew we were exactly where we were meant to be. Whether this was the beginning of forever or just another chapter in our story, it didn't matter. What mattered was that we were in it together, and for now, that was enough.